It's a pleasure to be here today with Paul Nahme, who is the Dorot Assistant Professor of Judaic Studies and Assistant Professor of Religious Studies at Brown University. His research focuses, among many other issues, on questions of identity, race, religion, nationalism, and the dynamics of secularism and public reasoning and how these topics interact with Judaism and the Jewish community. So thanks for taking time to talk today.
Cheers. Thanks so much for having me. It's a pleasure.
So I've been thinking a lot about the facade we have today of Jews and blacks being in sync. Now, of course, Jewish and black are not binaries. There's a huge number of Jews of color. But looking at the American history to understand better, it seems like we have this famous picture of Heschel and MLK, and we're like, oh, Jews were at the center of civil rights, and so white Jews, not to mention Jews of color, and black Gentiles are lock and sync today. But that's clearly not the case. And before we can even look at today how we can build bridges, I think it might be interesting to look at some of the history.
Sure.
And understand some of that context. So I think the first question I would ask you is, how would you understand some of the differing approaches between Jews and blacks around how we've responded to and articulated suffering and injustice, our own suffering and injustice?
Right. So I think it's an interesting, it is obviously an interesting history because when we look at the American context and we think a lot about this kind of storied history of like the civil rights era that, is, I think you're right, it's like kind of like a myth now at this point. It's in many ways because Jews have experienced a very specific history in Europe. And so when I say Jews here, I mean Ashkenazi Jews, primarily Jews in Eastern and Western Europe. But that's the suffering they draw on as a way of making sense of their own situation. And that was the same history that was invoked in the civil rights era to be like, oh, we recognize this sort of black suffering as something familiar to us, as something from our own past. Mm-hmm. And that was, in effect, like a way to mobilize like Jewish suffering as recognizable, or rather black suffering as recognizable to Jews. And that made sense for, obviously, immigrant Jews coming to America. But there are other ways in which I think, Jews have had a completely different history in America, mainly because Ashkenazi Jews, those that benefit from skin privilege, like white skin privilege, have been able to sort of participate. Once the doors were open to them to participate in American society, they did so willingly. And so that's, I think, where part of that history, like the black folks were never offered that opportunity because of the fact of pigmentation, right? They just can't escape skin color. Mm-hmm. It's like the Louis Armstrong singing, Ralph Ellison in Invisible Man, very beginning of the text, talking about listening to Louis Armstrong sing about like, what did I do to become so black and blue? My only sin is the color of my skin, like that kind of like, it's just this accident of pigmentation. So black folks have never been allowed that, but Jews have. And so I think that's part of the disconnect. But there are ways that I think thinkers in the past have had very similar responses to their community suffering. And so one example is like, and it seems very strange to put these two thinkers in the same breath, but looking at someone like Vladimir Jabotinsky and then looking at Malcolm X as two figures who have like looked at the situation that faces their communities and said, there is no hope for us. There's no future for us. So for Jabotinsky's case, there's no future for the Jew in Europe. And so for that very reason, we need to turn elsewhere and we need to find a state for ourselves or find at least some kind of autonomy for ourselves. For Malcolm X, similarly, there is no future for the black man in America because America is only for the white man. And so that's like a turn inwards to try and say we need to prioritize our communities first and foremost. And that's a very real and I think legitimate response to experiences of suffering. It also, interesting if you think about Malcolm X, is a reason why I think the myth of cooperation it is a myth because there's also, I think, a legitimate reason why for someone like Malcolm X to say, we need to prioritize our needs. And in Jabotinsky's case, there are lots of European Jews that claim Jabotinsky was a proto-fascist because he only prioritized Jewish flourishing. And in some cases, in a way that mimicked what many folks might have thought of like ethno-nationalist movements in Europe at the time as well. So those are two responses, but I don't think they're the only ones.
Yeah, you often hear that today still in certain Jewish circles that we're the lonely nation that dwells alone, and we can never really trust allies. No one will be there for us in the end. And so the only hope is the isolationist. Now, a state doesn't sound as isolationist, but I don't hear that same conversation in the black community, but I wonder, like, just looking back at the civil rights experience, it feels like MLK was drawing upon Hebrew scriptures. He could have had Jesus as the model, but he had Moses as the model, and that wasn't really drawing on a Jewish experience because that's part of their Bible as well.
Absolutely.
But Jews also latched onto them for their own acceptance. Civil rights movement wasn't just altruistic for them all; it was also a part of their own acceptance of being a part of that movement.
Right.
And so I wonder, what does it look like for to have the opposite response with Jabotinsky and Malcolm X? What does it look like when those have said, yes, we're really concerned about our community, but our fate really is intertwined? Mm-hmm. And how does our discourse of values kind of shift in that process?
Right. I mean, I think that's, in terms of what happens when you prioritize your community and alleviation of your own community suffering first and foremost, I think what it can do is that, I mean, yes, on the one hand, it can make you isolationist and it can make you turn inward to the exclusion of everyone else. Yeah. But on the other hand, I do think what it does, and I think it's interesting to say that Heschel and MLK both are good examples of the use of prophecy and a prophetic voice and the notion of what prophetic justice might have meant to either of them as a way of for their own purposes. I think you're right. MLK, growing up in the Black church, and the ways in which the role of the Exodus narrative. Yeah. This is Eddie Glaude has written on the ways in which the Exodus narrative helps configure an understanding of an African American religious, political religious history that makes those narratives so central to what a national identity would mean for Black folks in America. I think for Heschel, he was reading prophetic texts in a completely different way from the time of his doctoral dissertation forward, because he was looking for a kind of model of time and truth and the articulation of ethical norms. And so the fact that they were both doing this work on texts that they both claimed ownership over in very specific, that's where the bridge kind of emerged, I think, right? It wasn't that, I don't think Heschel said, what can I do to, find an access point to the project of the civil rights. It was that I think he was always already working on this. MLK claiming these are the possessions of a people that he belongs to, and independently while working on it, and they realize that there's something that they share in common, and that bridge emerges almost organically. I think is what makes them such interesting figures. And again, I think you can always have the more critical conversation of reading Heschel and trying to make sense of what his understanding of Black suffering really is, and where he positions himself in relation, in his community in relation to the Black community at the time. And also, I mean, there's lots to be said about, how for MLK towards the end of his life, he was also diverting in some ways from the kind of solely biblical focus. He became, I think the intention for his last speech was supposed to be to a labor union. I mean, this was before his assassination. He had a kind of shift towards a more socialist politics, and that might have been quasi anathema to Heschel, given his pleading for the Soviet Jews. So I think that it's interesting that the moment that they had overlap was because they shared this understanding of what prophecy meant.
So in what ways do you see conversation about the Shoah and of African American slavery in America as being productive? Those kind of comparisons, and in what ways are they somewhat destructive? Right.
So I think the ways in which, let me start with the way I think they're maybe destructive, because I think it's all too frequent. And as someone who teaches about race and modernity, and have a lot of students that ask questions about what about the Holocaust, if we were talking about about African enslavement and the Middle Passage, and they'll say, oh, well, it's the Holocaust is comparable. And comparison, that language really irks me, and I think it should irk all of us, because you fall into this kind of, when you do that kind of thinking, it's almost like you're keeping a pros and cons list. You're checking boxes, and comparison just becomes like a kind of Olympic kind of game, and I find that very negative. Because what then ends up happening is that we respond almost, it seems, to our feelings of discomfort, right? With knowing that, especially for Jews today, knowing that the suffering we're talking about is a past suffering, whereas for Black folks in America, up until this very minute, are still living that suffering. They're still subject to structural racism in ways that we couldn't even enumerate. And so that is where I think sometimes for Jews who are not Jews of color, that feel uncomfortable with the fact this is a historical memory, they seize on the comparison as a way of trying to like say we're in this together.
Mhm.
But that actually stops the conversation because and this is like, going back to some like James Baldwin's essay, blacks are anti-Semitic because they're anti-white, which is often a misunderstood essay. But I think what Baldwin's arguing there is that, to black folks in America, they don't see a history, they see a white person. And they can't see immediately why they should share a fate together. So I think that when the Holocaust is cited, that can be destructive to the conversation because it's basically saying, okay, but there's this historical fact we all have to admit is somehow, and often the Holocaust can be cited in this way, as like the greatest ill of all times, the greatest evil ever manifested. And look, the Shoah was horrific, and there's no way to minimize the suffering that Jews endured. And I'm married into a family of some Holocaust survivors, and the trauma is real. Yeah. The ways it could be productive, though, is not to simply compare it. I think is actually to say in which, like, look, we have to localize these sufferings. Yeah. So for the Holocaust, the ways in which Jews suffered because of the ways in which a very specific National Socialist ideology took what was absolutely a rhetoric of the Jews being racialized as other than human, that was real in the late 19th, early 20th centuries, absolutely. But it happened in a very different way than the racialization of Africans and then Black Americans. And slavery, I think, is different mainly because, and this is how I would maybe sum it up in a slightly theoretical way, there's a very real loss. Like, you have millions of people, Africans, who were stripped of their ethnic, cultural identities, reduced merely to skin color, and then had to basically make sense of that fact, whereas Jews have been able to float across color lines in America and Europe to pass. Their sufferings are real, but it's not the same. So maybe starting there.
It's interesting when these atrocities get recognized and how they don't get recognized. And the Shoah largely recognized. And even with Nuremberg trials and reparations, whereas black slavery never gets recognized. Obviously no reparations yet, although I'm an advocate for that. Or then you look at South Africa and the Truth and Reconciliation Act, which is totally different than the Nuremberg trials, and what it means to not really resolve with justice and to sort of punish. But let me ask you one last question. You've done a lot of work on Herman Cohen. How is your understanding of his thinking and the bridges he was looking to make intellectually informed how you think about the Jewish-Black expressions of freedom?
So I think what I found really interesting about Hermann Cohen, who was this, one of the most important later 19th century German Jewish thinkers, largely because what I found interesting, he wasn't writing Jewish thought. He was an interpreter of Kant and Neo-Kantian philosophy and gained success that way. But what Cohen did that's so interesting is that he, in effect, knew the German philosophical tradition so well, knew German cultural history so well, that he was able to basically say, look, Germany is a Protestant country. It's a Protestant, the whole idea of Imperial Germany was built on the recognition of Protestant Christianity being, culturally important to Germans. And he wasn't going to deny that and say, no, we should have this kind of neutral public sphere. He was like, yeah, that's the history of Germany. And Jews can fit into this because Protestantism allows Jews to similarly participate in a public sphere because it wants to separate church and state. That works for Jews. And so what he did, what I learned from Cohen was that he's basically giving this minority reflection on a majority culture. And by telling the history of this majority culture through the eyes of a minority, what it actually does is it kind of provincializes that history. So what would otherwise be German saying our story is the only story, it's the only story we care about. Through the eyes of a minority, it's it's just another story.
Yeah, totally.
And then then you line it up to the Jewish minority story. And by doing that, I saw something in Cohen's it's his method of just thinking, of comparing in a way that's not this is like this, but rather from my local position, I'm going to tell the story about the majority that I'm not a part of, or at least not immediately considered a part of. And by telling that story, I'm basically showing that it's just another discrete past. And there's something about that actually is productive because it allows majorities they're quantitatively majority. That's fine. But it also allows an entry point for another minority community to say we're fine with recognizing that this is a Protestant country. And this is how we fit into it.
Yeah. Amazing. Yeah. Super interesting stuff. Professor Paul Nahme, make sure to check out his amazing books and writings. Thanks so much for your time.
Sure, thanks so much.